The Revenant's history is perhaps the best presented and directly told stories in Elden Ring and Soulsborne history. A tragic tale of murder, violence, and innocence lost. A young, innocent soul ripped from the world due to the Knight's influence and reborn as a confused and vengeful spirit. Yet some confusion arises when trying to understand her true nature. We need to question if there is anything left of that original girl, Chloe, or whether the doll, Daphne, is an entirely new entity, born of the violence of that fateful night. When we meet her in-game, she has been drawn to the Knight's heart, and is facing an identity crisis, and through the course of her remembrance, she comes to terms with what she is and what happened at the Northern Croft estate. In this lore video, we will be unpacking the story of the fan favourite Nightfarer, and trying to make sense of her true nature. Let's start simply with her name and what it can tell us about her. A Revenant, according to Wikipedia, is a spirit or animated corpse that is believed to have been revived from death to haunt the living. Indeed, this is accurate, as the Revenant's existence is owed to the horrific death of a woman, and in addition, she is able to summon the spirits of her deceased family in order to wage war against her enemies. Revenants are also usually unquiet spirits, violent and vengeful, usually those who died in a terrible way, and thus want to take out their ire upon the living. This matches with the description of her ultimate ability, Immortal March, the codex description for which reads the following: release vengeful ire to make self and nearby allies immortal. This doll contains the vengeful spirit of a deceased woman, and her powers reflect this origin, a terrible event that was once again brought about by the influence of the Knight. Her in-game codex entry gives a great overview of this character, and it reads the following: doll of the daughter of an aristocratic family that faced ruin. On a fateful night, her soul took possession of the doll's body, and she swore to avenge her disgraced lineage. So what happened at this aristocratic estate? Who was this family? And whose spirit is within this doll? Well, thankfully we do get to revisit these events, as the Recluse assists the Revenant in confronting the Knight that resulted in her creation. In reliving these memories, the Revenant is able to interact with a painting of a man. Its epitaph tells us that this painting is of Edgar Blackcoat Northerncroft, the head of the aristocratic Northerncroft family. There is another item that seems to portray this gentleman, and that is the old portrait item, which reads the following: an intricate painting of a girl of pure heart, and an elderly companion that conveys both trust and affection. On that night the doll understood. The young girl wished to live, and with that understanding the doll found her purpose. On the back of the painting is a hurriedly scrawled, fading message: Chloe, seek happiness, for you deserve it more than anyone. My assumption of these two characters are as follows. Chloe is the daughter of the estate, and is the girl we witness being murdered through the course of the Revenant's remembrance. Edgar, the elderly gentleman in the portrait, is described by its item description not as her father, but companion. I believe this is because Edgar is her grandfather, not her father. I make this assumption mainly because of Chapter 5 of the Revenant's journal, in which she states that the puppet was carved for her by her grandfather. Just as an aside, in Chapter 2 of her journal, we also learn that the Northern-crofts were a family of master puppeteers, which explains both the craftsmanship of the puppet itself and the wealth of the family. From all this, it is clear that Edgar doted on his granddaughter Chloe, and thus carved this beautiful doll for her. When we revisit the night of Chloe's murder, we see that the Northern-croft estate is being battered by a terrible storm. I believe that this is the Nightreign, and what happens here is because of the Knight's influence. We have already seen in Wilder's story how the Knight can cause madness and violence, and thus it isn't surprising to me that this estate would be targeted in such a way when the Knight reached this region. Let's describe what we see in this memory. It seems as though the Knight reached the estate and it drove people to madness. As a result, the estate was attacked, and Chloe watched her family be brutally murdered, before she herself was discovered and killed as well in a very violent manner. One of the mistakes I made in my last video in regards to the Revenant's past was when I said that the murderer in this memory was Chloe's father. This was a pretty wild assumption to make, and state objectively, and so for that I apologise. That being said, I do believe it is possible that the murderer is from the Northern Croft family, so let's go over why. One of the main arguments against it being her father is because the murderer is clearly a lot younger than Edgar, but as I have just pointed out, Edgar is likely her grandfather, not her father. So the younger murderer could have been Chloe's father, driven to madness by the knight's influence. I also find it interesting that the in-game codex refers to her family as disgraced. Her family name could be disgraced if her father was the one who killed his kin, as kinslaying is always seen as an awful crime. That being said, it is still just speculation. I think what is more important is that the Northern Crofts were killed due to the influence of the knight. Whether the murderer was her father or another family member, or whether it was a random man driven to madness, is largely irrelevant for the grand strokes of her story, because either way, at the end of her story, it is the knight she holds responsible for her family's end, not the physical murderer himself. It also seems as though through the process of her remembrance, it is determined that the Night Lord is responsible for this tragedy and for her condition. Both the Recluse and the Duchess notice that the Revenant is being corroded by the night. Chapter 4 of her journal goes into further detail regarding this corruption as it reads the following. In the mirror, I conceal the ways in which the night eats away at me. As I apply the cosmetics given to me by the Iron Menial, I recall his words to me. Within your memories is a hole of not inconsequential size. It seems that the night is using this toehold to take root. The Recluse was the one who made this observation, but I know not how much she is worth my trust. That aside, I cannot grow accustomed to applying makeup with my own hand. Back at home, someone would have done it for me. As we have already discussed, the night is able to corrupt nightfarers when they lose their sense of self. The Revenant's loss of memory regarding her origins is the foothold it needs to break her down. The Duchess and Revenant explain that unless she faces the true reason as to why she fears the night, the corruption will spread, and she will likely become one of the contaminated nightfarers who we face at invasion sites. Following Revenant's reliving of events, she tells the Recluse she is now determined to bury the Night Lord, more or less confirming that the Knight was responsible for the violence that befell her family. In shaking off her fear of the Night and reaffirming her commitment for vengeance, she is free of contamination and will bring her fallen family to bear against the Night. Yet this is where I need to address another mistake I made in my prior video. I mistakenly referred to the girl Chloe as Daphne, when in fact these are two distinct entities. In the first visit to the Revenant's memory, we come to the study and are faced with a doll, and upon interacting with it, it gives the following message. An ordinary doll, carved with inexpert letters that read, "My darling little Daphne." So Daphne is the name of the doll, specifically, and again is the doll that is described in chapter 5 of her journal, a gift carved by her grandfather. I would also suggest that Chloe was the one who named it Daphne. It isn't unusual for children to name their favourite dolls or toys. I myself expertly named my teddy bear Teddy when I was younger. I find the fact that the carved words, the ones found on the doll, are described as inexpert, and to me, that is meant to imply that a child carved these words. Additionally, at the end of chapter 4 of her journal, the Revenant even says the following. The task finally complete, I caress the smoothness of my cheeks. Now I come to think of it, what was the name I gave this doll? As if the Chloe element of her is reflecting on the moment when she named this doll. Overall, her ownership of Daphne the doll is very endearing and further reinforces how pure a person she was. In the cinematic of Chloe's death, we see that the doll seemingly comes to life, and indeed this event is the one that is described by the old portrait that we looked at earlier. It says, on that night, The doll understood. The young girl wished to live. And with that understanding, the doll found her purpose. So here we understand that the doll, Daphne, seemingly became sympathetic to Chloe's desire to live, as if the doll is a separate entity entirely, and indeed in the cinematic it moves, while Chloe is still alive and hasn't yet been finished off. It is clearly this moment of struggle in which Chloe has her panicked thoughts of survival that Daphne then picks up on. Indeed, we can find further evidence within the Revenant's journal that the doll, Daphne, should be considered as her own character. And in her journal we seemingly get two perspectives, that of the doll and that of Chloe, as if they are both sharing this vessel. For example, in chapter 5 of her journal, we get the perspective of Chloe's spirit. She is looking upon the doll and its corruption, and reflecting on what she once named this doll. Then in chapter 6 we seemingly get Daphne's perspective, as it reads the following: "Dolls too have their dreams. This I know. The daughter of the house softly caresses my cheeks. Let's put on a little makeup, Daphne. I always liked having my makeup done." So here Daphne seemingly reflects on a memory, or dream, of when Chloe used to put makeup on the doll. Much like the executor, it is hard to determine whether Chloe is just confused, having an identity crisis, given she now occupies a new body, or whether there truly is some sentience to the doll. In chapter 2 there is some evidence of confusion as she writes the following: "I remember my name is Daphne, daughter of the prestigious house of Northern Croft, a family of master puppeteers." And yet Daphne was never a daughter of the house. She is conflating the doll's identity with that of Chloe. I would suggest that there was some semblance of awareness given off by the doll, in that it recognised that Chloe wanted to live, and thus it opened itself up to her as a new vessel. Chapter 3 of her journal further emphasises how the transition from Chloe's body to the doll's one was a difficult thing for her consciousness to process, as it reads: "Though my form is that of a doll, yet do I dream. Upon the night of the storm, nothing stirs within the estate, except for me now inhabiting the unfamiliar body of a doll, aimlessly prowling the grounds. Then something strokes my cheek. My conclusion is this: I believe that Chloe's spirit is within this doll, it is just that she has changed. There is something magic about the doll, as it did initially react sympathetically to Chloe's desire for a new body, and to carry on living. Chloe didn't survive this transition as the pure girl she once was, and thus has taken on the new identity of Daphne. She is a vengeful spirit now, and moreover she is struggling with her new physical form. Remember, the in-game codex overtly tells us that Chloe's soul took possession of this body. Daphne is who the Revenant is now. She is what remains of Chloe, the once innocent girl whose purity has been soiled by the violence of that night. She is something else now. She is a family's vengeance, and she will have justice served upon the night. As the last of her lifeblood spilled on the doll, Chloe awoke in a new body, and was drawn to the lands between. And before we move on, let us talk about her journey here. What is clear is that she didn't consciously travel here in a purposeful act. Like Raider did, for instance, as we noted earlier, it seems as though she just appears here with her spirit arriving at Round Table, before we are able to bring her into the fold fully. Again, her journal is a good source of information on how she arrived here, as chapter 1 of her journal reads the following: "Trying to escape from the encroachment of the night, I awoke. Checking my joints, I traced my way through clouded memories. But where was I? And why did the air smell of must and mould? I needed to know what was going on. That is where I decided to begin. The impression this all gives is that she basically woke up in her doll body, confused, but she knew she needed to fear the night. Thus she fled and eventually ended up here, chosen by the Round Table to serve as a night-farer. What is interesting is that a doll acting as a vessel for a soul is very much an established facet of Elden Ring's lore, given Ranni the witch slew her own body, and moved her soul to a doll so that she could free herself from the shackles of the two fingers. A similar transference clearly happened here. But how? Ranni was only able to achieve this result through massive efforts, using occult practices in order to split the Rune of Death between her and Godwyn. How was Chloe able to achieve the same effect without the use of the Rune of Death? Well, a few things come to mind. Firstly, it could be as simple as the nature of her death being so violent and traumatic that her spirit was able to defy the usual confines of reality. It could also be a residual effect of the night itself that allowed this to happen. As I discussed extensively in my Heal Store video, the night is clearly a force that erodes order, even causing time to collapse and the barriers between different worlds to break down. It isn't too hard to imagine then that the night broke down the usual barriers between body and soul, and as such, she was able to escape her physical form and take a new one. Ultimately, the Revenant story is another tragic one. A young, innocent girl transformed into a spirit of vengeance, someone who was ripped from her comfortable family life by the indiscriminate violence of the night. So that's it, folks. I hope you enjoyed this lore video. This video is a cut from a larger video from my main channel, but cut down so that it might find people who perhaps don't want to watch a 3-hour video. If you do want to see the full video on every Nightfare, it will be linked below, and if you'd like to see more, then consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. But until next time, I will see you in Limveld.